Now we're going to move on to talk about populations and samples, where we say a population is the set of all things that we could possibly consider for what we're trying to study. And a parameter is a measure on a population. Meanwhile, a sample is the subset of the population that we're going to look at, where a statistic is a measure on a sample. So you can think of statistics overall as being something like the study of samples, where in our last example, if you want to talk about it in this context, we could think of the population as the set of all potential forecasts that we could draw for the study, and the sample would be the set of 300 analyst forecasts that we looked at in particular, that we got that 44% value from. And the reason why we have this, the reason why we look at samples, is because sometimes populations can be difficult to work with. If we're talking about a study of all possible human beings in the United States, it would be quite a lot of work to get to them. And we'll see a little bit more about how we might have some issues there. So instead, we talk about samples to try and get some sense of the whole picture by looking at a part of it. And so to understand this a bit more, let's take a shot at a couple of examples. Where here we have that in a recent survey, 834 employees in the United States asked if they thought their jobs were highly stressful. Of the 834 respondents, 517 said yes. What we want to do is identify the population and the sample and describe the sample data set. So for this, we have that the population can be thought of as the people employed in the United States, while our sample would be those 834 employees that were specifically surveyed. So those 834 employees are meant to be a representative for the entire working population in the United States. It might be somewhat difficult to get to every single one of them, especially considering while you're working it might change. Where our data set is going to be those responses from the 834. In this case, that would be 517 yeses and 317 no's. It's also important to understand here that what we're talking about here as our sample and our population really depends on context. So here, the population, because we're specifically looking at working Americans, is the set of Americans who are currently employed. But if we wanted to, we could change it to just looking at any Americans, in which case our sample would be a slightly different representation. Or we could talk about that in a bit more specific context. We could say instead of being all employees, we could look at the employees in a certain line of work, or for a certain company even. It really depends on what we want to talk about, where that data we got at the end, since it came from a sample, is a statistic. Even though it's just 834 responses, that is still a statistic. For our second example, we have that in a study on entering freshmen in a university, they were found to have an average SAT math score of 514, where we want to determine if this is a measure, or if this measure, is a parameter or a statistic. So in this case, we're trying to determine whether those freshmen were a population or a sample. And what we want to do here, really to determine our answer, is consider the context. Where what we want to do is think about whether those freshmen are presented as anything else. If we're talking about those freshmen in terms of all students at the university or all freshmen at any university in any place, whether that's America or abroad, then what we have there would be a sample. But here, we're not seeing them in a broader context. Here, because we're only looking at these freshmen, we're only looking at these specific freshmen at this specific school, although it's not actually specific about which school we're looking at, but pretend we're looking at a specific school. It is a parameter. Again, the difference between a population and a sample is subtle and based entirely on what we're looking at. And here, as a result, the difference between a parameter and a statistic can be pretty subtle. But because we're not presenting those students in any larger context than just being students at that school, freshman students at that school, and we're not saying we're going to take 50 of them that walk into the door at any given time, we're taking all of them, that average of 514 is a parameter. And we'll talk more about how to get averages, what an average really means when we talk about measures of central tendency in a little while.